I woke up to an eerie quiet. It seemed early, but the alarm clock on the night table had no power. I picked up my cell phone, but it had no power either. That was strange. I got up and looked outside. My wife's car was gone, as it usually was when I got up. She was an early riser, did more before 6 a.m. than a lot of people did all day. She started work at 7 a.m. and was usually up for at least 3 hours by then. Had done a load of laundry, swept the kitchen and living room floors, fed the cat, and made my lunch before heading off to work. She was the virtuous woman described in the book of Proverbs, chapter 31. I worked second shift and generally slept till around 9 or so. Got up and enjoyed a cup of strong coffee while doing my daily devotions. My wife and I were both doing a chronological study of the Bible. She did her devotions with her coffee around 4 a.m. and would sometimes leave me notes of thoughts that she had about the verses of scriptures we read that day. When I opened the cupboard to get the coffee out, I saw a note she left me that morning. It was a smiley face on a post-it and simply said, "I love you." Sometime earlier that year, I had purchased an AeroPress coffee press and I just loved it. It doesn't take electricity. Perfect for prepping, I thought. I just had to boil a cup of water on the stove and run it through the press with some nice dark roast coffee that I made very strong. When I turned the gas on the burner to light it, I didn't hear the clicking of the electronic ignition, but I did hear the flow of propane coming from the burner. What the heck was going on? After trying to turn on the lights, I realized we had no power. Well, I guess that happens once in a while. No big deal. I got a match and went back to the burner, turned it on again, and lit it. After I made my coffee, I sat down to do my devotions and drink my first cup of coffee. I had seen my wife's coffee mug in the drain board. She uses a drip maker, so I knew the power was on when she first got up. I looked outside and I saw Dan and Martin, my two neighbors, out at the end of Dan's driveway talking. It seemed odd because, while they were always cordial and friendly with one another, they never really seemed like friends. I walked out onto the porch and yelled, "Hey, what's going on? Nobody works anymore around here?" In a joking way. They glanced over, both of them with a look of concern on their faces, and didn't say anything. That really seemed odd because the three of us always exchanged jokes and witty pleasantries pretty regularly. They started walking over to my porch and they told me that they also had no power and both of their trucks wouldn't start. Dan's Explorer was older, but he always kept it in tip-top running order. Martin worked for the city and had a brand new company pickup that he just got 2 weeks ago. Now I knew something was wrong. Judging from their demeanor, they did too. Dan was a few years older than I was. He was a veteran, Navy I think. He and I would talk at the fence while shoveling our driveways or washing our cars or whatever else brought us out to the fence. I liked Dan and enjoyed talking with him. I wouldn't say we were friends. I'd been here 6 years and never once been in his house, or he in mine. Martin was a little more standoffish. We basically just exchanged greetings when we saw each other. I could count on one hand the number of times we had an actual conversation. I was a prepper. I had food, guns, and ammo, stored along with water and other essentials. I never told either of those guys anything about what I had. I knew Dan was into guns, but I knew very little about Martin. A couple of times I had thrown a couple vague references out there to Dan about the current state of our nation and our need to be prepared and attempt to feel him out, see where he was with the prepping issue. He never bit, so I dropped it after a few times and let it be. We didn't know it yet, but the country was not the same place it was yesterday and was about to get much worse very quickly. Dan's wife passed away almost 2 years ago, and now he lived with his new lady friend. I didn't really know her. We said hi to each other in passing, and that was about it. Martin lived with his girlfriend who was a bit younger than him. They both had children of their own and also had a 2-year-old daughter together. Martin's children were older, and one was gone off to college, and the other just graduated high school, lived mostly with his mom. Martin's girlfriend was very friendly. We would chat sometimes during the day. If I was out working in the yard or garden, she was outside with the children. It occurs to me that we have some really great neighbors, but I didn't really know any of them as well as I should have after living here this long. Being a prepper, I know the importance of having a support group, a mutual assistance group. I always worked in that aspect of prepping, but truthfully it was very hard. In some cases, the people closest to us were on a different page when it came to prepping. Some even thought I was downright nuts. Then I would come across those that were into prepping but didn't seem like anyone I would trust enough to form such an alliance with. Heck, if someone I knew casually was willing to reveal so much about their prepping status to me, how could I trust them? Prepping wasn't a game for me, it was real. Martin told me that Ellie, his girlfriend, left the house just after 7 to bring her kids to school and go to work herself. By now, several other neighbors came out and reported that they too had no power and their vehicles were dead as well. I was very concerned at this point, but tried not to show it. I pulled Dan aside and shared my concerns with him. I told him I feared that this was a huge problem, beyond anything this small group of neighbors could anticipate. We decided to take a walk down the hill to the main road and check things out. I grabbed my SIG 1911 45 and 2 mags. Dan only had rifles, so I gave him my Ruger P95 and an extra mag. Told him I thought it would be a good idea for him to hold on to it for our walk. When we got to the bottom of the hill, at the main road, my worst fear was realized. As far as we could see in both directions, there were cars stopped dead in the road. There were people everywhere, confused and helpless. Actually, clueless was a better description. Dan and I looked at each other, and I could tell he had some idea what was happening. We decided to turn around and go back up the hill right away and report back to the neighbors what we had found. The small group of neighbors didn't know what to make of the situation. The hill we lived on had one very steep road, leading up to a 3-way intersection which dead-ended quickly in all 3 directions. I told my neighbors that I thought it prudent to take turns watching the road in, and they all agreed. George, my neighbor to the left, said he would take the first watch. He could actually sit at his dining room table and look at his French doors to an unobstructed view of the entire hill, almost all the way down to the main road. I gave him a whistle and told him that if he saw anyone attempting to walk up the hill, to give 3 short loud blasts followed by 1 long loud blast. He agreed. Our houses were all in close proximity and we were sure we would be able to hear the whistle. I went in and immediately went to my gun safe and took out my Ruger Mini 14, my shotgun, and my Smith & Wesson M&P 15-22 rifle. All my spare mags were loaded and I switched out to 10 rounders on both my rifles for a 30 rounder for the Mini 14 and a 25 rounder for the 22. Yes, I knew they were illegal in the communist state I lived in, but at this point I cared even less than I normally did for our ridiculous gun laws. I was one of the good guys, an NRA lifetime member. No honest, decent citizen had anything at all to fear from me. I placed the P95 I'd lent Dan for our walk on a shelf just inside the front door and the rifles by the side door where I could quickly and easily get to them. I strapped the shotgun over my shoulder, started to think about the rest of my day. It was now 12:30 according to my wind-up watch that I kept in my safe. My main concern was for Linda. If Martin saw Ellie drive off just after 7 a.m., it was a safe bet that Linda was already at work before the EMP went off. I'm assuming it was an EMP attack. What else would take out the power grid? And the vehicle power as well. That reassured me a little because we went over certain scenarios in case an event like this took place. The church we attended was just less than a mile away from Linda's work, and she knew that from work that was her immediate plan of retreat. It was on a main road, but it sat on just over 10 acres of land. The associate pastor, his pregnant wife, and their 11-month-old son lived in the house on the property, and I knew Linda would be safe there with them, at least for a little while, providing she could make it there. I was confident that she could. The short walk was down a side road which intersected with the main road about 200 yards up from the church entrance. Once there, she would be safe. Aaron, our associate pastor, wasn't a prepper to my knowledge, but he was a hunter, and I know he had guns. I had buried 5 5-gallon buckets of food, water, and a larger barrel of other essentials on the property. Linda and I were the only ones who knew where they were. When she got there, they could dig them up, if and when they needed to. She also had 3 days' worth of food in a backpack, which was always in her car. The larger problem was me getting there. It was obvious to me that my neighbors were coming unraveled quickly, and that without any decent stores of food and water they could potentially get ugly very quickly. It's becoming increasingly evident that I would not be sleeping in my own bed tonight. It is about 8 miles to the church, along a very main secondary highway. I had an alternate route that took me through a soccer park, state park, and several miles of old abandoned railroad tracks, and only very minimal road exposure. I estimated that route to be closer to 12 miles. I grew up in this town and spent many hours as a young man hiking and riding my dirt bike in the state park and on the trail that ran adjacent to the train tracks. I was confident in the route and knew it like the back of my hand. I decided to leave at dusk. It was just past half moon last night, and I knew I would have enough light to see by on most of the route, yet little enough to covertly move around as needed. I loaded my backpack with a few clothing items, some ammo, and other essential items and put the Ruger P95 in the side pocket. I'd been dehydrating various foods continuously for the last year or so. Because it was light, I filled the remaining space in my pack with it. Also in there was the Mini 14 with the stock folded back and ammo for all the guns I had on me. Glad I purchased that stock for the rifle. I knew it was illegal in this state. Because of that, I almost decided not to. After my pack was stuffed full, I forced my Bible into it on top and pulled the drawstring tight, buckled the lid closed over it. It was fall, but seasonably warm. I had put my parka liner in the ruck, but planned to wear the thin shell to conceal the pistol grip Mossberg 12 gauge that would hang from a strap around my shoulder. I still had 2 buckets each of black beans and rice, as well as 5 totes of various dehydrated and canned foods, and 2 70-gallon barrels of fresh water in the basement that I couldn't take. My main plan had always been to shelter in place, so the majority of my stock was here. I did have stuff buried in a few different locations, though, and would have to rely on those stores now. Oh, great. It's starting to snow out. It's warm. I don't think it's going to add up to anything. I told Martin and Dan what was left in the house, and for them to share it, and wish them the best of luck. What I hadn't told them was that buried in my backyard behind the garage was 12 more buckets of food and a 500-gallon poly septic tank that I purchased new and buried and loaded with canned goods, ammo, and all sorts of goodies. I wasn't about to tell them about that, just in case I had an opportunity to return at some point to claim it. Ellie went upstairs and came back with a radio that you could power by winding up or with a solar panel that was on the radio. Had several bands, including a ham radio band for listening, and a weather band, and AM and FM radio bands as well. She said she had purchased 4 of them for the family to use canoeing and camping and that she wanted me to have one. I gratefully accepted it and clipped it to the mollywebbing on my ruck. I had a similar one, but it was buried at my lot in Vermont. I'd meant to get 1 or 2 more, but never got that far down on my prep list. Our prep budget, being what it was, hadn't allowed it yet. Dan was a musician and a patriot, apparently. He came out with a small yellow flag with a coiled up snake and the words "Don't tread on me" printed on it. I had seen this image before. He told me that if I displayed it, it would identify me as a patriot, and that if I saw others display it, it meant that they quite likely could be trusted. I thanked him, shook hands with my neighbors, and knelt down and prayed to God for safety for both Linda and myself. Then I got up and I walked off into the twilight. I looked back at the house for what I believe could possibly be the final time.